After veterinary clinics across the state have seen an increase in a potentially deadly virus for pets, a co-medical director of a local clinic shared some tips. Parvovirus is a very hardy virus that can stay in the environment for years, surviving freezing temperatures, and is bleach resistant. In our region, the Eastern Maine Emergency Veterinary Clinic out of Holden has seen about 1 to 2 cases a week, which is not as high as it was previously. However, the Midcoast area has seen a much higher rate of it, which was confirmed by the Midcoast Animal Emergency Clinic in Warren last month.
I think we're seeing a combination of people not being able to vaccinate their puppies on time, and then because people are trying to socialize their dogs to be responsible pet owners, that they're going to public areas without being fully vaccinated to get that social interaction in the young puppies, and it's turning into kind of a snowball effect of one dog park gets infected, and then it kind of spreads like wildfire.
Canine parvovirus typically causes severe illness in young or unvaccinated dogs by being spread through contaminated feces. There's no specific cure for the virus. However, treatments and vaccines are highly effective.